news at 5:45 with Alastair Stewart.
The Duchess of Windsor, Mrs. Wallis Simpson, is dead. She'll be buried on Tuesday alongside her husband at Frogmore. The bombers strike at the heart of London, and the government shelves its plans to sell BL. Good evening. The Duchess of Windsor, whose love affair with King Edward VIII split the nation and cost him his throne, has died in Paris. She was 89. Buckingham Palace announced her death from bronchial pneumonia this morning with deep regret. She's to be buried next to her husband at Frogmore in Windsor next Tuesday. 50 years ago, King Edward stepped down from the throne to marry the then Mrs. Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The royal family never really forgave them. The couple lived their lives in exile, but the Duke said he had no regrets.
Churchill called it the greatest love story of the century. The story of a throne renounced for love, of a king who gave up everything to marry a twice-divorced American, creating the British monarchy's greatest constitutional crisis. Wallis Simpson was born Bessie Wallace Warfield, the child of a moderately well-off and well-known Baltimore family. From very early on, she developed a reputation for being unconventional and often embarrassingly outspoken. At her finishing school, she was thought to be daring and rather racy. Baltimore tongues wagged when at 20 she entered into a disastrous marriage to a young naval lieutenant. Earl Winfield Spencer, she soon found out, was a jealous alcoholic. She divorced him and within a year married Ernest Simpson, an academic American with what turned out to be a fateful passion for all things British, and in particular the royal family. Indeed, it was Ernest who introduced Wallis to Edward, Prince of Wales, at a house party in Melton Mowbray.
Our first conversation was surprisingly stilted and banal. And it ranged from the lack of central heating in British country homes and the ruggedness of the British climate.
And what was her early memory?
I remember coming back from China. It was after the Prince's trip to America. And there was a song then saying, I knew a girl who danced with the Prince of Wales.
Wallis was presented at court, which was then very important, in 1931. But she didn't appear in the court circular, which showed she'd really arrived, until 5 years later on Derby Day 1936. She attended the meeting with Edward, now King. In that same year, the King chartered a yacht to cruise the Mediterranean. He may have thought, because he was a little naive, that he was getting away from it all. But the cameras followed the couple everywhere. They were the stars of that summer. A photograph was published of the King with Wallis's hand on his arm. Their relationship was now the world's gossip, though the British newspapers kept an agreed silence. Wallis decided the King must make up his own mind, and in the winter of 1936, she secretly left the country.
There was no alternative. I had to step out of the King's life. He needed peace of mind, and I wanted him to be alone to make his own decision. In secrecy, I left England and crossed the Channel into France with one of the King's great friends, Lord Brownlow. That night, from a wayside hotel, I telephoned the King and pleaded with him not to abdicate.
Then the storm broke on a nation divided by ideas of love or duty. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, his cabinet, the opposition and the church refused to countenance the marriage. The King took the only course open to him, abdication.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
The couple were married 7 months later in France. Wallis was 2 weeks away from her 41st birthday. Thereafter, their conduct was somewhat wayward. They insisted on meeting Hitler despite strong warnings. The Nazis were not slow to capitalize on the visit. During the war, the couple were farmed out to the Bahamas, the governorship the only job he was ever offered. The war ended, there was talk of splitting up. They kissed their way out of that one. Public reconciliation with the royal family had to wait 30 years. Eventually, in 1967, they were invited to attend the unveiling of a plaque to Queen Mary, his mother, with all the family in attendance. There was even a chat with the Queen Mother, who'd been the most unforgiving member of the family. When the Duke died in 1972, she came from Paris to the funeral. For the first time, she was asked to stay at Buckingham Palace. At the lying in state, the women of the family grieved together. She never really conquered the loneliness of widowhood, and her health deteriorated very quickly. She lived on, attended by a couple of servants, in the great house in the Bois de Boulogne, the house that had been the scene of so much glittering social life. For half a dozen years, she lay in this room, looked after round the clock by 3 nurses. She was paralyzed. Only her strength of spirit kept her going, according to Monsieur Georges, her butler, who promised to stay until the end. So, in solitary sadness, ended a life that had been synonymous with gaiety, with vibrancy. And so ended a love story.
The Duchess of Windsor, who died today at her home in Paris. Arrangements are already in hand to fly the Duchess's body to Britain. Her funeral will be at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, and most of the royal family are likely to attend.
On Sunday, an aircraft of the Queen's flight will fly to Paris to bring home the Duchess's body, just as happened with the Duke's. There will be the most muted ceremonies in Paris and in England at RAF Benson in Oxfordshire, where the Duchess will be returned to British soil, an exact repeat of 1972. The funeral service will take place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on Tuesday, where only 3 days ago the Queen was at the Thanksgiving service for her 60th birthday. The congregation will consist almost entirely of members of the family. The Duchess will be buried at Frogmore, the mausoleum in Windsor Great Park, built by Victoria's Albert for their earthly remains. She will lie next to her husband under a plane tree.